welcome to our Health Nexus Accelerator program, which is a collaborative effort by NATHEALTH and IHFC, our technological innovation hub of IIT Delhi. And we are also proud that we have Path as our esteemed knowledge partner. So the topic for today's session would be navigating regulatory compliance, certificates, and strategies for market access and scaling. We have our esteemed experts, Mr. Vishnu Bhatt, the Chairman and Managing Director of Blue Neem Medical Devices Private Limited, and Mr. Dhruv Sahai, the Chief Operating Officer of Carpal AI. We have with us Dr. Seema Singh, who will be our esteemed moderator and a consultant at IHFC and founder of Unconsult. So without a further ado, I hand over the session to Dr. Seema. Over to you, Dr. Seema.
Thanks, Ankita. Before we start, are we expecting more startups to join?
No, this will be a recorded session and we'll provide the video time later.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Ankita. Welcome, Dhruv and Vishnu, to the session. Thanks again for giving your time today for helping us navigate some of the queries that we have been receiving from our startups from the NatHealth cohort. Before we start, I'll give you a brief overview of what we are trying to do here. So IHFC and NatHealth collaborated sometime last year. We came together. IHFC is the Technology Innovation Hub of IIT Delhi, which has been set up by under the NMICPS mission. For main aim is to do translational research. So we work very closely with academia and startups to bring technologies to the market. So as a part of helping startups with the market access, we tied up with NatHealth for this cohort. This journey, which started sometime in November, we gave out a call for proposal for startups, especially the healthcare startups who were TRL 7 and above, to apply for this cohort. Then we had a process of skimming and then selecting. So now we have a cohort of around 22 startups whom we are taking through these programs. Essentially, we have some expert sessions to answer some of the queries that we have received from them. In the month of January, we will be doing a 3-day intensive kind of a boot camp with them in IIT Delhi's Sonipat campus. And post that, we will be helping them reach out to hospitals for their pilot programs and all. Just give me a second. Let me close the door. Yeah, sorry for this. So today's session was aimed essentially at navigating the regulatory and the compliance part of it, and then coming to the market access part of it. So to start with the regulatory and the compliance part, if you people could just share a bit of an overview how health tech startups in India they should approach the whole regulatory part of it. That will be a good starting point for us, and then we can take up the specific questions that we have compiled.
Sure. Seema, would you like me to start?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so of course, I mean, when we're looking at regulatory and compliances across the health tech sector, it is to be taken in all seriousness. I mean, from our quality management systems to the way the technology works, all that has to be drafted properly and submitted. One has to look at all guidelines around data security, cyber security, and the works. Sorry, Seema, am I audible?
Yeah. So coming specifically, you had a brief query on the group also, and we spoke about the startups that we are, kind of mentoring. They fall into two broad categories. One would be the hardware kind of startups who are building devices, the medtech devices, and the second is the software, where the software is medical device or other software related compliances come by. So let's talk about both categories separately. So if we talk about the hardware landscape, about CDSO guidelines and all, so if you could tell us kind of very brief snapshot of how does that work.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, you're looking at CDSCO, you're looking at FDA, you're looking at CE. Broadly, the world over, there are different risk categorization for medical devices. Okay, these could be categorized as low risk, moderate risk, or high risk, and it varies. I mean, for example, FDA would categorize this as class 1, class 2, class 3. CDSCO in India categorize this as class A, B, C, and D, with A being low risk and so on and so forth. And then CE has 1, 2, A, 2B, and 3. Uh, it's very important to determine what category risk the medical device would fall under. And for that, there are frameworks and regional guidelines. In India, you have the CDSCO guidelines. Globally, you have the IMDRF, you have FDA's digital health regulations, you have the EU MDR, and which would give you a very clear idea on the impact that the software or the hardware would have on health, and what category to basically put it under.
So broadly, when you say a risk, what does that translate into? So
It's very simple. Risk basically is its impact to life. So, I mean, something which works with cardiology would be considered high risk. Something that works with, let's say, radiology would start off at low risk, could go to moderate risk. Something that, let's talk about, well, the most common and the most popular devices today are insulin monitoring devices. Okay, most of these would fall under a class 2 category.
So, if I kind of rephrase, the risk would be how much impact it is going to make on the patient's life in terms of impact on medical decisions, and also does that also come into this picture?
Sorry, I didn't get your question. Could you repeat that?
So, when we say risk, and I'm just trying to paraphrase what you said, does it also qualify as the impact it is going to have on the clinical decisions? Or
Of
is it
course,
like
absolutely,
invasive versus
because
non-invasive?
when we say impact on life, what it does is whatever medical devices it is going to, I mean, influence life critical decisions, and that's the impact it will have. So that's how you will qualify risks. For example, I know there was this whole topic about digital therapeutics. Okay, digital therapeutics would not qualify in any way under a class 1 category. They would qualify under either class 2 or class 3. Okay, because this has a direct impact on life critical decisions that the user will be taking.
Okay. And what about the SAMD category? The software as medical
I
device?
mean, broadly, it's the same risk category. See, SAMD is software as a medical device, and MD is just basically the hardware. So, I mean, the risk classification will remain the same. Now, for example, a diagnostic imaging software for, let's say, cancer detection would fall under class 2. But let's say there's a wellness app for tracking calories, that would be a very low risk class 1. Or, well, for CDSCO standards, class A or class B/C.
So, for the purpose of this discussion, if I want to focus more on, let's say, the CDSO guidelines, so there we have class A, class B, class C. So, what is broadly the difference? Let's say I have a class A device versus a class D device. What's the broad difference in the approach?
Class A are low risk devices, class B are low to moderate risk, class C is moderate to high risk, and class D are high risk devices. Now, I mean, like I gave you an example, a wellness tracking app would be a class A device. A class B device could be, well, diagnostic imaging, could be pathology. Anything pertaining to cardiology would fall under class C. So, and moving forward, if you have something that is looking at direct detection of, let's say, cancer, or is actually the diagnostic hardware, that could fall under class D category.
And then in terms of clinical trials, if you could talk more about which categories would need a clinical trial, which would not need that.
So class A does not require a clinical trial.
Mhm.
Uh, class B would require, well, retrospective studies. So would class C. Class D would require post-market clinical trials as well.
Okay. So coming to class A devices, and this is a specific question which some startup has asked, since there is no requirement of clinical trial, what all would a class A device need?
So again, this goes back to the first part we were discussing about, following guidelines that are provided with frameworks with IMDRF, with FDA digital health regulations. Basically, you need to make sure everything in terms of safety and performance is duly documented within the user manuals, how the device functions, how the user interacts with it. It's critical to have that all mapped out onto documentation. Then there is the global standard for risk assessment of medical devices. It's called ISO 14971. It's good to basically ensure maximum compliance to that. And then comes the other side of things, which is your quality management systems, for which you have ISO 13485. So, I mean, a class A device for CDSO standards, if it meets all these requirements and the legal parameters, then a class A CDSO registration, I mean, should be fairly straightforward.
So, which kind of brings us to the next thing that people have been asking us about ISO and QMS. So, what can you tell about startups about those?
I mean, ISO will cover QMS and go beyond. So, I mean, across, let's say, medical devices, now, when we are looking at from a global perspective, also, we are looking at broadly two main categories of ISO, which is 13485 and 27001. 13485, which works specifically with the quality management systems, and 27001 that works specifically with data security and the safeguards that you have in place to ensure data security. Uh, I mean, both are equally critical. Both are important, and both are guidelines that should be, I mean, complied to. Sorry, am I audible to everyone on the call?
Yes, Dhruv.
Yes, we can hear you, Dhruv.
I think Seema's screen has gotten frozen.
I'll just check with her.
Sure.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you.
Hi, am I audible? Sorry, I got disconnected.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes,
We can
you are.
hear you now. We can hear you now.
I thought there was something wrong with my internet connection, but I'm glad it wasn't me.
I'm sorry, I got disconnected. So I assume you spoke about the ISO and QMS. So from a practical standpoint, if organization is getting a third party manufacturing done, so how does this ISO certification and all pan out that way?
Excellent question. And also a very, very relevant question, because that's where we usually see the misses. It's very important when you're working with a third party to ensure, I mean, in terms of QMS, to ensure that they have ISO 13485 compliance. If they are a low risk, or if you're in a low risk product, you still should, ensure ISO 13485 compliance. There are enough bodies in the country that would do ISO 13485 certification. Of course, there's an advanced level to that, which is called MDSAP standards. But to begin with, ISO 13485. Uh, well, on the medical device side of things, also there's a lot of data that these devices collect. So ISO 27001, and of course compliance with the new DPDPA is very important. Uh, 27001 is again going to check for proper systems put in place, proper safeguards put in place. Now, I mean, let's say for example, you have a software as a medical device, and just for the sake of the conversation moving forward, I'm just going to call it an SAMD. Is deployed on, let's say, a wearable that is developed externally. It is important for the software provider as well as the hardware provider to ensure that they are, ticking off all the risk management requirements, and they're also complying to usability standards, which are also provided, under CDSEO guidelines. And this needs to be ensured throughout the product's life cycle. Now, how do you ensure it? You ensure it by conducting regular audits, compliance checks. There are very well reputed organizations that do provide you with consulting engagements, and they would monitor this for you on let's say a month to month basis. So it's critical. I mean, and specifically critical for the organization or the startup in this case, which is taking ownership of the device.
So are there some well-known organizations that you could just, give us a few names for the sake of ease of our startups?
Why not? I mean, well, the bigger organizations are the likes of, let's say, for auditing purposes, I think one leading organization which covers almost all standards in India is Intitech. From a consulting standpoint, you have the more reasonable options of locally available consultants like Cratical. Then you have the high-end consultants like KPMG.
Okay. So this will be helpful. So when we
I'm,
are
and I'm happy. I mean, because I don't want to run down to the entire list, but I'm happy post the call to share a list of consultants. I mean, we have a ready list of consultants as well as advisors and auditors, and I'm happy to share that list with you. I mean, if somebody needs to be connected, happy to help on those fronts.
I think that will be really helpful.
Seema, quick question. What is the stage of your startups that you currently cohort? At what stage are they in? I mean, where do they stand with respect to their product development, or
So
how big are these organizations? How small are they? I mean, just so that we provide them the right context.
So the cohort is, we have only included the product ready startups, which are either their approvals are done or who are just in the early stages of approval, but the product is ready to go to market. So that is the stage. We have not taken any early stage startups in this cohort. The product is either already approved, serious, and everything is done, and they are just looking for, getting connected to the right clients, or they are just in the process of applying for CDSO and ready to hit the market. So because this program.
So is it fair then to assume that the basic constructs of QMS and the risk management frameworks are all pretty much done, so that it's mostly now rubber hitting the road, that's where they are, or do they need information about how to start thinking about some of these things?
So theoretically, when you say a product is ready, they should have gone through it. But we all know as startups, when in the beginning, at times you do not think about all these compliances and risk management, and later also you need feedbacks. So when we ask the startups what kind of knowledge they need, some of us did ask about, more about how to optimize this process, how to get it done faster, how to make the clinical trials go faster. So I would assume that they do need some support in this also. I mean, it's all good in theory to say that from day one you should start thinking of design for your approvals and all, but that doesn't really happen in startups.
Yeah. No, I think Dhruv had very, very valid data points and information on
This
things.
I asked you about. Pardon?
No, I think we lost a connection for a bit. I don't know if it was my connection or Seema, your connection, but yeah, what I was saying is I think Dhruv provided quite a bit of information on the ISOs and the CDSO and the details around that. I just would like to add a couple of things on this. Can you hear me, Seema? Am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you. I just switched off my camera to save my bandwidth.
Okay. So I think a few things for the startup founders to think about. I mean, there is a whole lot of information on what categories your products will fall under and how to classify them from a risk profile standpoint. Is that what I often find is that most of the startup founders are extremely passionate about their technology. They're extremely passionate about the idea. They're extremely passionate about what this technology can do in terms of its value add, etc. More often than not, I think the clinical aspects of things are generally not well understood. And that's where I think the biggest pitfall is, because most of the startup founders are technologically very savvy. They understand technology to the core, but clinical is not their forte, right? And unless you have a doctor or a clinician as part of your co-founding team. But how does technology and clinical come together in a way that adds value to the patient has to be completely understood. More so from a risk management perspective. I think Dhruv did touch upon that quite a bit. Now, in that context, in the context of risk management, what I generally advise startups, the one that I mentor, are that do not look at it from a compliance standpoint. If you start looking at it from a compliance standpoint, you're looking at paperwork. I would say look at it from patient safety standpoint. No patient should be harmed by using your technology. Now, that really brings a very different perspective to startup founders to say, what does that actually really mean? So your risk management aspect takes a very different meaning when you take an approach of saying that, no patient or no clinician's outcome should be adversely impacted by what I provide as a service or a product. Now, if that becomes part of your culture, of your product development strategy, and so on, then obviously you can bank on a lot of material that is there in the ISOs and the CE frameworks and the CDSCO guidelines and so on to be able to do that. So ultimately, if patient safety becomes extremely high on your priority list, that you feel very passionately that your technology should add value and should harm no one, then compliance is natural. Compliance should not become a paperwork step that you have to pass to get your product to the market. So that's a different approach. So risk management becomes a very different ball game when you take that approach. So that is one thing I would very strongly urge the startup founders to start thinking differently. On a risk management standpoint, I think 2-3 things to understand is that everything that we develop, either a software or a hardware that goes on to use on a patient, involves risks. These risks need to be mitigated. Every risk has to be understood, and I would encourage the startup founders to extensively work with clinicians to understand those risks. Look at a whole lot of information on any predicate device that has been in the market, which offers something similar. Understand all the risks and try to mitigate those risks in your design so that those risks actually don't occur in practice. And very clearly understand the risks which are residual, meaning the risks that you could not address as part of your design to be addressed. And those residual risks are disclosed to the clinicians. And it becomes part of your brochure or material to say that, look, these are the risks that still exist and that can be mitigated by either a manual intervention or monitoring. Now, that becomes the core strength of the product. And if you really get through this process really well, then compliance, is simple because, that is the idea of the regulator also. What I tell the startups is that, look, if patient safety is your priority, so is that of the regulator. So it's no different. So compliance then becomes part of your DNA. So that's on the risk management side. It's a mindset that people should start thinking differently. And really look at risk management as something which is very important to ensure that your product will never harm a patient and ensure that the clinicians can benefit from it. So, and then obviously, there are a whole lot of details that, Dhruv mentioned about, the risk management framework for, the ISO classification of that, and also for data privacy and security. And this applies to both the diagnostics as well as things that would be involved in surgeries. And both of them would mean that the clinicians are dependent on the technology that we provide to provide outcomes to the patients.
No, but I could agree more with you, sir. I mean, I think you summed it up very well. I mean, when you're looking at regulatory approvals or you're looking at compliance, don't look at it from the perspective of paperwork.
Yes.
Understand the value that you are bringing, and that value is going to impact a life and several lives. So you have to understand that. I mean, this is where the stakes are the highest. Everything that you do would lead to impacting a life and to a great extent saving that life. And if you are mitigating all risks to that extent, the paperwork will always fall in place. So if you're developing a product, and I do feel it was a very important point that when you're doing anything in med tech or health tech, it is very important to have clinical feedback on your product. Either you have a clinician on your co-founding team, or you have a consulting clinician who's advising you. Very important to do retrospective studies before you go to market. Very important to see how your device is working, and it's important to, of course, highlight any and every risk that it carries for the person using it. So no, absolutely, very well put. That it's. I mean, like picture behind me says. I mean, it's patience, not data. That needs to be the attitude.
Just to add a couple of other points, I think a lot of times what I keep telling some of the startups is that there are 2 or 3 failure points when it comes to either the risk management or even the products being able to hit the market. How do you know that your requirements are complete? Do you really have completeness of requirements, which is part of your input to actually design the product? And second thing is, how do you know you have tested enough before you go to the market? And I think that's what Drew was also alluding to in terms of the validations before you hit the market. And these are the 2 things, along with risk management, that needs to be tied together to ensure that your product is almost as near complete as it can be. Obviously, no product is perfect. It gets perfected over a period of time. But I think given that we are in the business of providing technology for health, it is an obligation from our side to make sure that our product is almost as perfect as it can be. So a robust process of requirements gathering, a robust process of requirements verification through your risk management framework, and a robust process of clinicals before you actually hit the market. And it takes as long as it takes. There's no shortcuts for something like this. These would be very important steps before you hit the market. And if those are done well and documented well, I think the rest of the compliance frameworks is simple. And if there's a very strong desire to do it the right way, these all become reference materials. I would say that whatever CDSU has put forward, whatever ISO has put forward, whatever CE framework has put forward, they're all reference materials. And don't stop at anything. If you don't get it in CDSU, go to FDA and get them. Right? So that should become the DNA of the organization to do it the right way, and use them as reference materials as you go through. And then everything else becomes easier to be in compliance with what the compliance requirements are. That would be the second point. And the third thing I just wanted to reflect on a little bit is on ensuring that as you work on your product, keep the history alive, keep the process with which you have gone through documented. Because a lot of times in retrospect, it's very difficult to go back and think what really happened 2 years ago when we were designing something. But it becomes an important step to keep logging what has worked, what has not worked, so that your design history file becomes rich and becomes, and often most of the startups don't give a thought to that because that's not, it's not interesting to do that when you're into innovation mode. But I think given that we are in the business of healthcare, I think we have to take that very seriously. Keep documenting your decisions, keep documents, even though in very early stages, keep documenting your decisions, keep documenting the various phases of evolution of the product, the different versions that you go through. This can come in extremely handy when you look at historical reasons why a certain decision was made, and helps in really building a strong design history file. To be able to, they will learn all this. Most of the startups will learn this eventually. But the process of getting started on it, happens a bit late. And sometimes you're left wondering, why a certain decision was made or why a certain decision was reversed. That's what I advise most people, saying keep documenting your design decisions, keep documenting your design reviews, keep documenting your intermediate trials, so that you have kept a good trail of your design evolution, and that becomes a very strong database for your eventual requirements for risk management or compliance or whatever. Yeah, I'll pause here for a minute. the next question, or if Dhruv has anything else to comment on.
Yeah, I think Vishnu, you summed it up really well. If I could kind of, state two takeaways from this. One is designing for patient safety, which is very important, which I was like alluding to, that usually, startups halfway through they realize that they should have kept that in mind from the word go, which is something which all of us who work with startups keep on, repeating, that you have to have that in your DNA from day one, that patient safety has to be paramount. And the second very important thing that you said is keeping a record of the journey, which I am sure more than one startup whom we speak to would have, made the mistake of record getting lost. Especially, I have worked with a lot of digital startups. The journey that the product, digital or tech product, goes through, hardly there's any documentation. You are in a kind of a mission mode, always hustle mode. Hardly any documentation happens. So I think these are very valuable insights that you gave. So Dhruv, just to kind of round off the discussion that we're having on compliance, would like to hear a bit about the data part of it, especially when we talk about a lot of almost, I think 50% of our startups are in software. About data compliances in India, or if they are, going internationally, if you could kind of just a few words about that.
No, absolutely. So, what you're dealing with here is the next level of personal information. It's patient health information. It's as confidential as it gets. And adding on to the whole discussion that we've been having on why everything that you do in medtech or health tech has to be patient centric, whether it's the quality or the performance of your product, or whether it's the data that it's processing or collecting. Of course, I mean, we have several different codes of data compliances. We have, from safeguard checks in the ISO, which is the ISO 27001:2022 standard, to GDPR, to UKMDR, to the DPDP Act in India. There are data regulations everywhere. There's also, very specific standard contractual clauses that have to be incorporated for cross-border transactions. But again, I'm again and again going back to the C. As long as you have your top priority and your main priority and goal is to make an impact with patient health, all these compliances are something that you will have checks for. I mean, it's critical in the health tech industry to anonymize data before it crosses borders. Now there are different countries have different laws. For example, a country like Singapore is so strict it won't let the data leave the hospital, let alone the country. The data has to stay within the hospital. So if anybody is developing a device or a software, it has to be implemented within that hospital, within that system. It cannot be done over, let's say, a cloud or an API based integration. So I mean that's how it varies from jurisdiction. Australia would let data leave the hospital, but not let data leave the country.
Okay. And there's one question we have received, which I would kind of like to bring up, is it possible for an Indian manufactured product to get CE or US FDA clearance without having an offshore company registered or associated with the third party in their jurisdiction?
So 100% yes. What you need though is local representation, whether it's US FDA or whether it's the CE or whether it's the UK mark. Post Brexit, just to be clear, UK does no longer follow the CE; they follow something called a UK mark. You can get FDA, you can get CE, you can get UK mark. You need local representation for this, which essentially is your regulatory consultant, who basically is also your local contact address, who will coordinate everything there, but you do not need an entity registered there.
Okay. I think that kind of answers that very specific question. Just one more question before we move on to more of, market access and scaling strategies. How can a health tech startup obtain licenses and certifications on a fast track basis? This might be a bit counterintuitive to what we have been talking
Yeah,
about.
I was just going to say that yeah, I mean, look, complying with all the guidelines from the word get-go, which you yourself said is something that nobody does, is the fastest way to get there. But again, Adding to what Vishnu said is, if you are creating a product where you are identifying risks, where you're documenting every step of the journey of the product's evolution, getting compliance certifications or regulatory clearances is basically just that. What are they going to look at? They're going to look at your user manuals, they're going to look at your quality management systems, and they're going to look at your trial results.
Hmm.
And if you're looking at patient safety, and that's your top and only priority at that point of time, all these requirements are already met.
Hmm. On a related note, you see, this is about having the right checks and balances in place. From a process perspective, what is your experience in, like, government has launched portals like MedTech Mitra for kind of helping the startups navigate this and that. So, in your experience, how much has that been helpful in essentially navigating the process and the government machinery part of it for the startups?
No, tremendously helpful. One, because more than simplifying or fast tracking the process, they're creating awareness.
Hmm.
They're creating awareness of the process, which when I talk to startups, I feel most of them lack the awareness of these processes. Then of course there's this whole concept of a predicate device, which you will see very prominently across US FDA requirements, where you look at a similar device which works in a similar way, and you use that as basically somewhat of a role model to apply for regulatory clearances.
Hmm. Okay. So now coming to the kind of the next phase of the startup's journey, while regulatory is one challenge that they all have to navigate. Once the product is approved and they're ready to hit the market, we all know, all of us who have worked in healthcare realize how difficult healthcare is to crack. So Vishnu, in your experience, what are some of the biggest mistakes that startups make when they hit the ground running?
I think the biggest I have found is that the assumption that if you have a great product, market will just take it. Not so true in the healthcare world, because the healthcare world is trained and evolves processes and frameworks and procedures with a protocol in perspective. And changing that protocol is not something which is like selling it into a retail world or into a manufacturing world and so on and so forth. So the transition to really change the processes to be able to accept a new product is a long drawn process.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if you build a software that is, that has a great value for a retail organization, you can get them to transition, in a month's time. Not possible in a healthcare world. So the evolution of building credibility on a technology or a product is a long process, and rightfully so, because it's again, it goes down to the element of risk management, training, physician awareness, physician training, and a broader acceptance of a technology or a solution, which needs to be understood by the fraternity before they can switch over and start using something new. I think there are two kinds of products here. I think for startup founders, it's important to understand whether you're creating a disruptive technology or it's an incremental innovation, right? If it's an incremental innovation, it is relatively easier. If it's an incremental innovation, then you have a predicate device that Dhruv was talking about earlier. Predicate means there is something very similar to what you have built, which means that there is a great degree of familiarity with that in the ecosystem, and you're providing something better. And in that case, your process of trials are easier. You may not have to do a full-fledged clinical trial. You may have to do a clinical investigation. So your time to market is relatively easier. You have a reference product to refer to in terms of how your product performs with respect to that product. So if you have a incremental innovation, it is it is a faster cycle to really convince a market leader or a practitioner to be able to switch to your product. But if you have a novel device, it's a much longer process. Typically, what we find is that a very novel device is much better accepted if it comes from a known brand. Right? If a brand is very familiar to a physician or to a healthcare ecosystem, and they bring a novel device, the desire to look at it very seriously is very high. But if it comes from a lesser known startup, a small company with limited resources comes out with something new, it's a harder battle. So it is important to create that small ecosystem to understand, okay, which is that first port of entry which will give me legitimacy, and start using the product that we bring out, and then use that as the basis to go further down. So I think it depends on the kind of product that you have. If the risk profile of the product is not very high, then the desire or the propensity to use them faster is higher. But if the risk profile is higher, the ecosystem is a lot more careful. So I think it's important to understand where do you really sit with your products. Do you have a predicate which you can refer to? Is your innovation incremental innovation, or is it disruptive? If it is disruptive, then it needs a larger change management process in the field to be able to take your product to the market. So I would put this as a frame to start to assess, saying, how difficult or easy is it for you to start making your product known in the market and start adoption.
So on the second part where we talk about, disruptive products, and I completely agree with you that it's very difficult to, for a startup to get that trust and push that product. So what role do you think channels or partnerships or existing distributorships could play in such a situation?
Yeah. So see, I think I would broadly put this across as 2-3 categories of products. Software is one element of that, and mostly the purchase patterns of software as a medical device. Mostly, I think it plays in the diagnostics world or in the hospital management side of things, which I think has a different life cycle and ecosystem, and devices which would be used by clinicians for surgical interventions. I would say that the ones which are used for surgical interventions are the ones which have a slightly longish life cycle from to go to market. So I think in case of the former, I think the distribution network has very little role to play. In the latter, there is if you deal with products which are components that you deliver, distribution network plays a role. However, I think for startups, you really can leverage a larger ecosystem if you can partner with a better known company, for example, which has the reach across the different channels, which have the reputation of understanding this landscape better. Then you can leverage one of those larger organizations to become your partner to take the idea to the market, right? Where the startup can become the solution provider and the larger brand can become the market access partner. So that's one approach to look at it. If your product is more discrete product, which is actually used in a cath lab, or it's used in a surgical process as a device as part of things, then obviously the distribution channel, which is actually more familiar with the hospitals, more familiar with the purchase patterns, more familiar with the pricing constructs, that becomes an important channel to tap into. So I think the key thing that we have in this ecosystem is that the kind of products, the kind of complexity of the product, and the ecosystem channels are very varied. So if you were to sell something, again, I take the example of retail. It's very simple to understand. There is one way of doing business with retail. But there's not one way of doing business with the healthcare world. It's very fragmented. The buying patterns are very different. The buying frameworks are very different. And what you provide as a solution are also quite varied, right? So for each of that kind, it's important to understand that, which is the ecosystem that you plug in that will make you more successful faster is an important thing to understand. A lot of times I find that, initially when a startup builds the product, there is not much thought given to market access, which I think is a very flawed or a very risky approach, because by the time you finish making your product, you're lost, right? Or suddenly the complexity becomes huge. So what I generally advise startup founders, and especially if they're very tech-oriented startup founders, is that, look, innovation is exciting. Except that excitement ends when your product is finished, because going to market is hard. The dirty work begins then. When I say dirty work, I'm saying the hard work, the complexity of getting to market, getting acceptance, and that is when they lose steam. And that is where I've seen most very innovative products start to hit the shelves. They get shelved because the founders either have not much depth in that space, or they start finding it too unexciting or too difficult. Now, that has to be understood early on, right? So I generally suggest that the founding team should bring on a co-founder, possibly a co-founder who has good understanding of the market or has the acumen to navigate the market. I don't like the word to be used to navigate compliance, because compliance is not navigation. Compliance is, you have to do it. It's part of the DNA. It is not something that you keep aside. You have to navigate the market. And that's an expertise that you need to have within the co-founding team, if possible, so that there is somebody who is thinking about it all the time, because the complexity of market navigation should start during the development of the product. A lot of times, and that's why I keep saying that, look, is your requirements complete? The requirements should also include things which are important for the market commercially, because that's typically ignored. When you look at requirements, when you design a product, you take a lot of things about technical requirements, some clinical input is there, you complete the clinical requirements, but you don't pay attention to commercial requirements. And by the time you build the product, it's already too late. You already have a product which costs a certain way, which behaves a certain way, and the market doesn't really look at it favorably. So I think it's important to have in the founding ecosystem someone who understands this landscape, who understands navigating market and the complexity around market, and who starts thinking about how do we really approach the market while the product is being designed. It should never be an afterthought. And that's what I would say, that it's very important to start building that into your product development lifecycle. Market is not outside your product. Your product has to be in the market, right? So those are the 2-3 things I would suggest the co-founding team to think about. And again, I think it's important to understand where your product fits into the purchase life cycle. Who makes the purchase decision of your product? Is it the biomedical department that makes a purchase decision? Is it the clinician who makes a purchase decision? Is it the purchase of the organization that makes a purchase decision? Is it the management sale? If it's a large capital equipment, it is a very different life cycle of how they procure it. If that is understood, then is your product a novel device? If your product is a novel device, it has a very different approach to getting it done. You have to create a larger awareness of it. You need to have larger key opinion leaders endorse the product. You have to have white papers talked about in conferences that this is the new approach that's coming up. Larger education is required. It's a very, very long and expensive process, and that needs to be factored into the evolution of the product. If it's an incremental innovation, you can bank on the predicate to say that, look, there's a predicate that you are very familiar with. I can do something better. So it's a much faster time to market. But somebody should be thinking about this while the product is being designed, not after the product is complete.
Absolutely. I think I quite echo your thoughts. I work with startups on the product market fit, and that's what this thing is. That's not a one-time exercise. It has to start even before you identify the problem.
Yes.
A lot of times startup founders, they start with this product. They do not start with the problem. And then they kind of retrofit the problem onto a product that they have already built.
And that's invariably too late when they do that. And that's
So
Yeah.
most of the times the problem that they identify to solve in itself is not large enough or relevant enough. So they, that's what I always tell them, that you have to put 10 qualifiers on the problem itself before you
Right.
go ahead.
Right.
And interestingly, that thought is very interesting, that depending on how new or how big your product is, you should, decide on whether you want to take it to the market yourself or you want to tie up with a existing player, or I think that's a very helpful way to take. Dhruv, would you like to add anything to this go-to market thing from your experience?
No, I mean, well, I broadly agree. I mean, first coming to the sales cycle of things now, being a part of a health tech startup myself, I can tell you sales cycles in health tech are much longer than retail sales cycles. There's a lot more that you need to prove that your product can do. Uh, there are certain parameters which cannot be compromised on, especially in the health tech space, things like turnaround times, things like accuracy. And also, I mean, of course, you have to develop a product that caters to a need. If there is no need and you're developing a product, then you have to develop it in a way that it works much better than all the other products that exist in the market. So, I mean, that's broadly how you would look at the product market fit. Also, identifying the right market is critical. I mean, well, for example, I can just give you a broad example. For example, AI adoption right now, which is happening all over the world in health tech. You have to see what jurisdictions are more open to AI adoptions, what healthcare systems are open to AI adoptions, and then reach out to the relevant people within those organizations or those healthcare providers. It's extremely important to understand who your target audience is, who you are selling to, and what is it that this person wants out of you. And without understanding that, you're not going to get the right product market fit.
Absolutely. And also talking about the sales cycle, I think one thing that a lot of health tech founders, they, miscalculate is the conversion rates and the lead time to sales in healthcare, which is, much lesser conversion rate and much longer sales cycle. So like today afternoon, I had some discussions with some of the startups who were, kind of giving sales projections. They had totally not taken into account that lead time of 6 to 9 months, which, whatever you try in healthcare, it's not going down. So I think
9 months is fairly ambitious. It's usually much longer. Also, I mean, the other thing that maybe we haven't spoken about is the whole idea of to embark on this journey of your sales cycle, offering proof of concepts, because that's also going to help you in evolve your product better. It's also going to help you cater your product to meet a certain fit. So that's the other thing that founders should bear in mind is when you're looking at customer acquisition, you're not just looking at sales and marketing. You're also looking at investing in POCs. And when I say investing in POCs, I mean that because you are incurring a certain cost.
right, absolutely. So we have some 5-7 minutes left in this conversation. Very quickly, some people have asked about fundraise. So we understand, even if you have the right product, you need to raise funds to be able to, essentially healthcare is something which needs deep pockets. Product development cycles are longer, sales cycles are longer. So Vishnu, in your experience, what are the, kind of few key mantras for a health tech founder who's out in the market for raising funds? What are the 3-4 things, that if they nail it, then things will become easier for them?
I think the fundraise question is something which is, I don't think it's very specific to healthcare. It's the same philosophy that any startup in any space would bring out. Now, the two things that I think they should think about, one is that the risk profile of a healthcare product is higher. Because turnaround times are usually longer if something doesn't work, right? I mean, if it's a product which is which let's say that fails a POC, to make it successful, it is not a 1 month exercise. because every change that you make involves a significantly long clinical trial, right? Without that, you cannot go back for the second POC. So therefore, for any investor, the risk profile is higher. So therefore, it's important for the founder to have answers to most of the questions, and especially with respect to, like you said, market sizing, the time to market, having a fairly good understanding of that, and also to have a robust, robust history of your MVP or whatever you call it as the first product that's out the market, that's going to be in the market. And the second thing is extremely good clarity on what you're raising the funds for. And that's often not well understood, right? Because a lot of times you raise funds for product development, but there's not enough fund for market entry. That's underestimated, generally highly underestimated. So what I generally do is encourage startup founders to have a very strong business plan for 5 years. Do you have a clarity of your business plan for 5 years, and how real is that? Right, and that's an important thing, because when you raise funds, you have committed to someone that you will return it back with returns. And you have to be very, very clear on where it will be deployed and why, their money is better invested with your organization. So I think that clarity is very important. A lot of startup teams, especially the young team, which is very passionate about the technology, has to invest some time to really think about how that will fructify for an investor. So most of the fundraise, discussions, are weakened when that clarity is not very clear. So I would say that, raise funds when you absolutely need it. Raise funds for very clear reasons of why and where that will be deployed. And raise funds for the most complicated part of your journey. Try to raise, because that's really where you need the resources to be able to overcome. Because no startup is the same. For example, I've seen startups which have come from a very market-oriented setup. They know how to take an idea to the market. They have been there. They understand this ecosystem really well. For them, product development would be requiring funds, because you need to assemble a good team. They need to put the technology together. They need to create a product which really matches. So they understand what the needs of the product are. They understand how to take it to market. They know exactly what the value proposition is, but they cannot build the product on their own. So you need to raise funds to be able to complete that picture, so that you are able to invest and bring the best of people to be able to build that product for you. If you're a technology startup and you understand technology really well, you understood the requirements from a technology standpoint, you really need funds, for example, to get across the clinical trial. So like what Dhruv was saying earlier, class 4 devices, which is something in cardiology. The clinical trial will be horrendously expensive, right? It will be the most expensive part of your journey. You need to understand that. Now, and that is something which you cannot get across on your own. You need a larger ecosystem to play with you. You need some leading hospitals to partner with you. You need some leading KOLs to partner with you. Animal trials are super expensive and long, right? And you need to bring that to life. So you need funding for that piece. So it's important to understand what is your product, which is the life cycle that's going to be the most difficult for you to navigate, right? And the one that will be mostly resource intensive from what the strengths you bring to the table, the strengths you don't have. And bring the funding to overcome those challenges so that you can bring the best resources to bear to be able to get across the line. So having the clarity of journey is important. That's why I keep insisting saying have a 5-year or a 10-year roadmap, so that you know exactly, and the reason I'm saying 10 years for a healthcare startup, because your initial gestation period is long. The higher the risk the product is, you may be in development for 10 years for all you know, until your clinical trials are done. So I think having clarity of that understanding is very, very crucial, because a lot of times as technologists, we tend to underestimate the complexity of getting the product to market. And that's when you start, and then you start discovering things along the way, and then you do multiple fundraisers, and then the moment you do multiple fundraisers not without enough results, you start losing confidence of the investors, and those start to play out. So as much as a complete picture you can have with respect to what is the nature of your product, understanding your own strengths, and fund the strengths that you don't have. That's what I would say. You need to focus on.
I think find the strengths that you don't have is
Yeah.
quite an interesting take.
Yeah.
So Dhruv, in your journey, what has been the toughest part of fundraise?
Well, I think what you need for fundraise, and what our learnings and takeaways from, is always have a very clear go-to-market strategy. I mean, understand what your focus areas are. Don't get into plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. Okay, you have to be very, very clear on what your product is going to deliver, how it's going to evolve. Also have clarity on projections, and like Vishnu said very, very clearly, I think that's the most important part of this, is every investor that's going to look at you will want to know how you're going to spend that investment. So it's very important to understand what are the costs that you foresee, what are the expenses that you foresee. In your journey, it is important to calculate what your burn looks like, what is your customer acquisition cost. Well, this is maybe a little further on from early stage, but also what kind of runway are you looking at maintaining, how are you looking at expanding, what markets are you looking at targeting. Everything has to be well documented, there has to be clarity, there has to be a foresight on projections, and those are things also. In terms of while you're doing the fundraise, something that I have always advised founders is, well, operational control of their organization is essential. At no point of time should there be a compromise on that, because that is what would kind of influence decisions and impact the end result. But yeah, I mean, well, long story short, to sum it up, go to market strategy and clarity on projections and how you're going to spend that money. Those will be my two mantras for understanding fundraising.
I think I totally agree with what you said. So I think this brings us to the end of this session. It was very interesting talking to both of you, and I'm sure our startups will be able to derive a lot of insights from this. Especially things like you have to think about patient safety, and as well as going to the market right from the word go. You can't plug these things in at a later stage. And for fundraise, clarity is the most important thing, as both of you emphasized. Once again, thank you both of you for taking time out to talk to us. It was a real pleasure having both of you. Thanks, Ankita, for putting this together. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Seema. And wonderful talking to you, Dhruv.
Likewise. Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.